Being an amateur linguist, such as I am, the history and evolution of the different language families has always fascinated me. Always. From the time I started learning Greek and Latin and French and Hebrew and well on to today. As a result, the biblical story of the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel also fascinates me. Now, most will take this biblical story as a myth or a legend about how the different languages came about. The thing about legends is that every legend has a kernel of truth to it. And I have a hypothesis for what this kernel of truth about Babel might be and how this might have happened. So the story of Babel goes like this, reading from the World English Bible. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Excuse me. As they traveled east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they lived there. They said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and burn them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top reaches to the sky. And let's make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad on the surface of the whole earth." Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men built. Yahweh said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing will be withheld from them, which they intend to do. Come, let's go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So Yahweh scattered them abroad from there on the surface of the earth. They stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of all the earth. From there Yahweh scattered them abroad on the surface of all the earth. That's found in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Okay. So Babel, or Bavel, is the ancient Hebrew name for Babylon. In turn, though, Babylon as a culture and a people inherited a great deal from the even more ancient Sumerian people, including religion, territory, and language, especially their written language. What's interesting about this, too, is that even as late as 500 BCE, that's about 500 years before Christ, they were still using the ancient Sumerian language in their religious, liturgical, and magical rites. But by roughly 3000 BCE, so 3000 years before Christ, the Sumerian civilization consisted of at least a dozen city-states, including Kish, Erech, or Uruk, Ur, Sipar, Akshak, Larak, Nippur, Adab, Umma, Lagash, Bad Tibira, and Larsa. When the biblical text describes Abraham as having left Ur of the Chaldeans, Chaldeans are another name for the Babylonians, even though Ur, during the time of Abraham, approximately 2000 BCE, give or take about 100 years, was the city of a Sumeria in the process of collapse due to a number of factors. Ancient Sumerian is considered a language isolate, that is, a language with no known siblings or daughter languages, and a part of no known language family, though there is strong evidence to indicate that Basque might somehow be a descendant. Unlike Indo-European languages like Latin, Greek, or Sanskrit, it is an agglutinative language rather than an inflected language. Unlike Semitic languages, it doesn't follow the three-consonant pattern of verbs and word cognates. All things considered, it should bear as much resemblance to either language family as a tribal language from Papua New Guinea. None at all. But what's really intrigued me about ancient Sumerian, and what throws a bit of a monkey wrench into it being a language isolate, are the first-person singular and second-person singular pronouns. Why? Honestly, I mean, I realize that sounds pretty silly in some respects. Why would I be focusing on the pronouns? I focus on the pronouns because they follow both the Indo-European and the Semitic patterns, the way that they're built, or rather the way that the phonemes are put together. What's so significant about this? Because pronouns, because of their very nature, are some of the slowest parts of speech to undergo changes in the natural evolution of language. Okay, so here I'm going to get a bit more technical, actually a lot more technical, as I build my case. So please bear with me. There is a point to it. So to give an example, look at the word for I, the first person singular pronoun. In Indo-European tongues, it always follows a vowel, velar vowel pattern of some kind. So it would be like a vowel and then a sound like a k or a g, or one of the fricatives of those. So vowel, velar, vowel pattern. Sometimes the first vowel is omitted, sometimes the latter one is omitted. Sometimes, as in modern English, the velar is omitted, but you will never see, say, a vowel dental vowel, that is, a vowel followed by a t or a d or a th pattern in Indo-European or Hamido-Semitic languages, for example. To illustrate what I mean, so in Hittite, which was roughly between 1500 and 2000 BCE, the word is uk. In Gothic, between 4 and 600 CE is ik. In Anglo-Saxon, it's either ik or ich. In Latin, you're talking ego. In Greek, also ego. In Sanskrit, from 1500 BCE, aham. In Sumerian, the first person singular pronoun morpheme is gu. When you look at a word from the ancient Semitic languages like Hebrew, you see the elements of this within the pronoun as well. Anochi. In Akkadian, a Semitic language contemporary with Abraham's Sumeria, and the language, honestly, is what he probably spoke. The word is Anoka. And in ancient Egyptian, it's Anuk. So you see the same agreement with this, and you see the same agreement with the second person singular pronouns. That is you, or in Elizabethan thou. And you see a dental vowel construction. So you see in Hittite it's zik, in Gothic it's thu, Anglo-Saxon also thu, and later thou. Latin tu, Greek su, Sanskrit tavam. In Sumerian, the second person singular morpheme pronoun is zu. In Hebrew, the second person singular masculine pronoun is ata. In Akkadian, it's ata. And in Arabic, it's anta, nasalizing the dental consonant. For more examples, the Sumerian word for father is abba. Hebrew and Aramaic ab or abba. Or ada. Greek familial, ata. The Sumerian word for mother is ama. Hebrew em, Indo-European mater, meter, etc. The word for son is dumu, Indo-European sunus, Hebrew ben. The word for river or watercourse is hubur, Greek hudor, water. There does seem to be a sound change between B and D between the Sumerian word and the linguistic descendant depending on the family. One interesting word is ila in Sumerian, which means elevation or something high, but is also the Akkadian word for God, Elah, as well as the Hebrew Elo. And of course, a modern cognate would be Allah in Arabic. There's also the word for earth, ki, which is nearly equivalent to Greek ge. Also, an, meaning sky, isn't far removed from Greek ano, meaning up. Finally, the word abzu, meaning sea or abyss, isn't far removed from Greek abysson, meaning virtually the same. There is also an argument to be made for dumumus or dumutor, meaning daughter, being the direct ancestor of Indo-European dugator. Interestingly, the Akkadian for daughter is ahatu, which is one dental consonant away from falling into the same Indo-European pattern. There is also the Sumerian word igi, meaning eye. That is, the eye. It is clearly a cognate of the German word augo and the Anglo-Saxon ege, from which our modern word eye descends. And suggesting it as a cognate of the Hebrew ayin, doesn't seem like much of a stretch either, given how it descended in Germanic languages as I and Oye in Norwegian. Now, when you compare the rest of the Sumerian language to any Indo-European or Semitic language, you start running into inconsistencies and differences of vocabulary. But more importantly, you run into major differences in how words and sentences are put together. Grammars are completely different between these language families. All ancient Indo-European languages, for example, are inflected in some way, using word endings and suffixes to indicate who's doing the action, when the action's being done, and what part any given noun plays in a sentence, whether it's a subject, an object, an indirect object, and so on. And it's just as complex with verb forms. How many Latin students have driven themselves to tears trying to learn the Latin inflections in high school? So you have a root morpheme like ama in Latin, and then you stick a personal ending on it. So ama plus t, amat, to indicate that he, she, or it is doing the ama. That's the general idea of an inflected language, right? In the Semitic languages, all verbs and nouns are derived from a three-consonant root, and the vowels you place in and around these consonants change those consonants into the word you want. So in Hebrew you have be like YLD, or YLD, which can be Yeled, meaning boy, or Yalda, meaning girl, or Yalad, meaning to give birth. And this is just how the internal logic of these languages go, whether it's Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, or Akkadian. Another piece of this puzzle, and something that's interesting about language, is how it's learned by children. Children are born with the capacity for acquiring and building language, but they are not born with a language pre-programmed. Children will acquire a language from what they hear of the sounds, which those around them are communicating with. But more accurately, children will build their own languages based on those sounds and what they assume they mean. Adults will correct their mistakes over time so that the language the child builds conforms to the mutually accepted and intelligible version of that particular combination of sounds. The critical window for language acquisition in children is roughly from about 1 year old to about 3 or 4, and can extend up to about 10 years old, or puberty, depending on the child. So how does everything I just said all fit in with the confusion of languages at Babel? I'm getting there. There's one more component to this puzzle, and that's how and where the brain processes language, and what it can look like when it fails. The brain processes language in the left hemisphere in a specific areas called the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, and the angular gyrus. There are, however, different kinds of neurological disorders which come under the label of aphasia, which can wreak havoc on a person's ability to speak and understand language. These disorders come from a degeneration of those areas of the brain which deal with speech. They can range from a loss of words, a confusion of the meaning of words, a loss of grammar, keep that in mind, and more. This degeneration can be caused by stroke, brain infection, brain tumors, brain injury, and other things which might affect the brain tissues. It is Broca aphasia which is most relevant to our discussion here, because it is in Broca aphasia specifically where we see a loss of grammatical structure and the loss of the use of conjunctions and prepositions. According to one paper on the subject by Aninda Acharya and Michael Broughton, the most common cause of Broca aphasia is a stroke involving the dominant inferior frontal lobe or Broca area. A stroke in the Broca area is usually due to a thrombus emboli in the middle cerebral artery or internal carotid artery. Other causes of Broca aphasia include traumatic brain injury, tumors, and brain infections. Hypothetically speaking, where Babel was concerned, let's assume originally everyone at Babel, or whichever city of Sumeria Babel represents, maybe around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, or rather 3,000 to 4,000 BCE, so between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, probably closer to 6, was speaking some ancient form of Sumerian. Then, at one point, something happens where certain large parts of the population were struck with a degeneration of the language centers of the brain. Perhaps it was divine intervention, not ruling that out. Perhaps it was something environmental, not exclusive of divine intervention, perhaps. Maybe it only affected the adults, but not the young children. The adults lose their grammar, or perhaps their grammar becomes scrambled. So, for example, in Elizabethan English, you might have the question, knowest thou me? With the grammar scrambled, it might come out, meest thou know? Or Hamlet's famous quote, to be or not to be, being scrambled into not be, to or. In an agglutinative language where words can be built of many morphemes or smaller word components, which must be in a specific order in order to make sense, this would be catastrophic for communication. Where the story of Babel begins to make sense is that when these adults begin to pass on this scrambled grammar and language to their children, who were not affected by this language degeneration. As to why young children wouldn't be affected, it is just a thought, but perhaps the aphasia only affected those on the tower building project, mostly being adults or children capable of working. It would have required potentially thousands of workers or more, and children old enough to walk and speak, that is, those older than the critical window for language acquisition, were rarely spared from working in ancient times. Something about that project, perhaps something environmental, perhaps it had something to do with the dust from the area, perhaps it had something to do with molds or spores. Something about it caused a specific kind of neural degeneration which affected their language centers. As to what the cause might have been, again, maybe a type of bacteria around the stone being used or something toxic in the stone dust might have caused the neurological deterioration which led to the aphasia. The children then naturally build their own languages based on the way adults are speaking, using the same morphemes, but in different combinations, and make their own changes of meaning, vocabulary, and grammar as these new pidgins coalesce into Creole languages. In a way, this is how the linguist Steven Pinker describes children transforming a pidgin into a Creole in his book, The Language Instinct, where he writes, specifically speaking of Hawaiian pidgin. Pidgins are choppy strings of words borrowed from the language of the colonizers or plantation owners, highly variable in order and with little in the way of grammar. He then goes on to say, the linguist Derek Bickerton has presented evidence that in many cases a pidgin can be transmuted into a full complex language in one fell swoop. All it takes is for a group of children to be exposed to the pidgin at the age when they acquire their mother tongue. That happened, Bickerton has argued, when children were isolated from their parents and were tended collectively by a worker who spoke to them in the pidgin. Not content to reproduce the fragmentary word strings, the children injected grammatical complexity where none existed before, resulting in brand new, richly expressive language. The language that results when children make a pidgin in their native tongue is called a Creole. This is something which has been demonstrated several times by several different groups of children. One that Pinker uses as a longer example in his book is a school for the deaf in Nicaragua in 1979, where the children developed their own fully expressive and developed sign language independent of any known version, but based solely on their own made-up signs. There are also stories of unethical experiments throughout the centuries of children raised in language isolation from birth, developing their own spoken languages unintelligible to anyone but them. Returning to the situation at the Tower of Babel, perhaps those who were affected by this Broca aphasia were isolated into camps along with their families, or even returned to their own walled cities in the region if they had been relocated to the city where the tower was being built. As a result, one group of these children in a camp, building a Creole out of their afflicted parents' speech as they reached adulthood, either couldn't understand those from other camps or cities, or the others sounded like idiots to the one because they couldn't talk right. And human beings have a long history of looking down on and isolating from those who speak differently from them. Eventually, these new groups of people either move off and away from Sumeria and those people who sound like idiots or barbarians, or they're forced to by those who still speak proper Sumerian. It's not difficult to imagine the rest of the unafflicted Sumerian population calling these people cursed by the gods and driving them off with their families into exile. They would have taken their young children, still learning language, with them. The whole process might take 100 years or less if a generation is every 20 or 30 years. Another observation when discussing the Babel text in Scripture is that the four main cradle civilizations, which would have been impacted, were all established at nearly the same time. The Sumerian civilization proper was established from an earlier settlement and culture, around 3500 BCE. The Egyptians were established as the Egyptian civilization around 3150 BCE, not terribly long after. The Minoans were around 3100 BCE, and the Indus Valley civilization, also representing the Indo-European language group, was around 3300 BCE. So we're within, all of these civilizations were established within a few hundred years of each other. And they're all kind of in almost a wheel. They're within a radius of ancient Sumeria. With perhaps the exception of the Indus Valley group, these cradle civilizations more or less represent the Table of Nations found in the Genesis account just after the Babel event. So if we're looking at some kind of a time frame for the Babel event, I would say that it would fall probably at the beginning of the 4th millennium BCE, at the latest, and probably hundreds of years earlier than that, around 6,000 years ago, give or take. Not every language can be realistically linked with any part of ancient Sumerian, but I think there's a good case to be made for the Indo-European and Hamido-Semitic languages, originating at least from the morphemes of Sumerian, based on the pronominal structures, as well as other similarities between vocabulary. Languages like Chinese, Japanese, and the many minority languages found in Papua New Guinea and among the Native American populations, not to mention the many sub-Saharan African languages, like Swahili and Xhosa, in my opinion, clearly have an independent origin from Sumerian, but the Genesis account actually only focuses on the origins of the Indo-European and Hamido-Semitic language and family groups anyway. That is, only those people groups and languages around the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, as far as ancient Persia. It does not concern itself with the other people groups and languages which must have been in existence when it was written. It doesn't talk about the ancient Chinese, who were already a civilization at the time. It is therefore not a stretch to suggest that the Babel account may only be referring to the origins of the various languages within this geographical region at the time. Is this what happened? I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that might stand up under a stress test with a few modifications as more data might present itself. I think it does at least present a workable basis for the events of the confusion of languages at Babel as recorded in Genesis. Yes, this is all speculation, but it's possible speculation, which is all I'm suggesting right now is that it was possible. There are mechanisms that would make it possible, and there is linguistic evidence to suggest that morphemes from ancient Sumerian made up the roots of the Indo-European and Hamido-Semitic language families, just as the scriptures suggest.